Good afternoon. I'm Mark Baldessari, President of the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to our program today. First of all, I want to thank the Sutton family for making this fascinating conversation possible. And I can tell you it's going to be fascinating because I had a preview upstairs. We were having lunch together, and it's just incredible panel we have here today and facilitator. So Tom and Maryland and Matt Sutton, who are here today, thank you very much. And for also, I just want to thank our former and current board members who are here to join us today. John Bryson is sitting here with the Suttons. Nice to see you, John. And thanks to everybody in the audience for joining us. So we have a wonderful turnout. I hope that you enjoyed your lunch and had good conversation. You're really in for a treat here today in terms of the discussion we're going to have with our panel on climate change and California's future. I hope that after our program is completed, that you'll stay and continue the conversation, because we're planning to have some coffee afterwards and really an opportunity for everybody to have a chance to visit a little longer. I also want to mention today that our program is here at the Bechtel Conference Center, which has been a really important place for convenings and programs at PPIC, and for that we're very grateful to the Bechtel family who made this possible. And Steve Bechtel is here today, and Lori Docks, and thank you very much for also being part of this very important dialogue today. Before we get started, I just want to make two brief requests. First of all, you'll notice in the materials that we've provided to you that there is an evaluation survey. PPIC is in the polling business, among other things, and so please fill out that survey. And to all of you, and I've already been reminded once by my staff, please silence your cell phone. So now we go on to the program, which, as I mentioned, really important dialogue, part of our ongoing efforts to raise awareness about policy issues and policy initiatives in California. Today's on climate change and California's future. First, we are going to hear from Sonia Pettick, who one of my colleagues on the PPIC statewide survey team. Sonia is a research associate and project manager with the survey, and she's going to provide us with some context for today's discussion in terms of California's policies and Californians' views on climate change issues. At the conclusion of her remarks, we're going to welcome our panel, which will be moderated by Michael Krasny and feature Secretary Chu, and Chair Mary Nichols, and Secretary George Shultz. We're honored to have you all here today, and I, without further ado, want to welcome Sonia Pettick. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Hello and welcome. It is a real honor and privilege to open our event, which features such a distinguished panel of speakers today. I'm just going to spend a few minutes setting the stage for the discussion by providing some background on public attitudes toward climate change and state efforts to address it. As it is on many issues, California has been a leader among states in the area of climate change. One of the first major pieces of legislation designed to curb greenhouse gas emissions was Assembly Bill 1493, passed in 2002. It set tailpipe emissions limits for passenger vehicles, and after a lot of legal wrangling with the federal government, the rules went into effect in 2009. They were not only copied by other states, but became a model for new national standards set by the Obama administration. Since the law was passed, the PPIC statewide survey has consistently found that an overwhelming majority of Californians favor it. In 2006, Governor Schwarzenegger signed a landmark piece of legislation, Assembly Bill 32, the Global Warming Solutions Act. AB 32 requires the state to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by the year 2020, and the California Air Resources Board is responsible for its implementation. We began asking Californians about this law in 2006 and have found that at least 2 in 3 express support each year. And as I'm sure you all remember, AB 32 was the target of a 2010 Citizens Initiative, Proposition 23, which would have suspended the law until unemployment was at 5.5% or less for a full year. The measure was defeated. We see a possible explanation in our surveys where the prevailing attitude is that government efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are not antithetical to job growth. Most Californians, in fact, think that such efforts will result in either more jobs for people around the state or will not affect job numbers. And we have found Californians increasingly likely to say that the state government should act on its plans to reduce global warming now, rather than waiting for the state's economy or job situation to improve. Given their consistently held belief that global warming is a reality that must be addressed right away, Californians' support for state action persisted through the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. State government efforts to reduce global warming are multifaceted. Another major piece of legislation, Senate Bill 375, was passed in 2008. It supports the state's climate change goals by setting regional targets for vehicle emissions and requiring communities to integrate transportation, housing, and land use planning to meet these targets. Strong majorities of Californians favor some of the subsequent plans and policies that state and local governments have adopted to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including requiring an increase in the efficiency of commercial and residential buildings and appliances, requiring oil refineries and commercial and industrial facilities to reduce emissions, changing local land use planning to reduce miles driven, and reducing the carbon intensity of transportation fuels. Another key component in the state's approach to reducing emissions is the market-based cap-and-trade program. Although it was fully implemented earlier this year, Californians remain very much unaware of this program. Those who say they have heard a lot about it are largely opposed. In future years, slightly more than a third of cap-and-trade revenues will be spent to improve environmental conditions in disadvantaged communities. Most Californians say this is an important goal, but the perceived importance is far higher among Latinos, African Americans, and lower-income residents, the very groups that studies have shown will be more adversely impacted by the effects of global warming. Strong majorities of Californians believe that global warming poses a very serious or somewhat serious threat to the state's future economy and quality of life, and they express concerns about some of its specific effects, such as droughts and storms, and particularly wildfires that are more severe, as well as increased air pollution and flooding. In the absence of federal legislation to limit greenhouse gases, California has recently made agreements with China, the Canadian provinces of Quebec and British Columbia, and the western states of Washington and Oregon to coordinate climate reduction efforts where possible. This type of leadership, action independent of the federal government to address global warming, has been consistently well supported in PPIC surveys. In addition to building on efforts to reduce emissions, the state has adopted adaptation strategies to plan for the future impacts of global warming. The vast majority of residents consider this an important goal. An enduring theme from our annual surveys is that many residents expect more from their elected officials. This should provide encouragement to policymakers as they continue to grapple with what Governor Brown has called the world's greatest existential challenge. Now, before I ask the panel to the stage, I would like to introduce our moderator, Michael Krasny. We are so pleased to have him with us today. Michael is the host of KQED's award-winning program, Forum, a news and public affairs program that concentrates on the arts, culture, health, business, and technology. Forum is one of KQED's most popular shows and the nation's most listened to locally produced public radio talk show. Michael, thank you so much for being here. We look forward to the conversation. And I'd now like to invite our panel to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. It's certainly a pleasure for me to be here and an honor to be with this distinguished panel. And I must tell you, I think I was trying to convince a person seated next to me that this voice does go with this face. But I'm glad to be here, and I'm glad you're here, because I think actually we can really accomplish something here today. Speaking with the panel before over lunch, I was able to realize just how dedicated they all are and how really illuminating their thinking is going to be. And we are going to get into some specific areas that I hope will be enlightening and will actually make for good citizenship and make you increasingly aware and more illuminated and bring light. Let me just tell you who is on the panel with us. These are people who really need no introduction. To my immediate left is Steven Chu, former Secretary of the Department of Energy, a Nobel Prize laureate and professor of physics, who is also certainly well known for his work, not only in the energy field, but obviously getting a Nobel Prize in physics, and who has contributed a great deal and continues to contribute a great deal to the whole discourse on climate change. Mary Nichols is head of the Air Resources Board in California, has been since 2007, has also been a major figure in terms of working for reform where climate change is concerned, and in fact was part of the Clinton administration. And just this morning told me that she was talking to some Russians trying to give them guidance on what they might do in their infrastructure under Putin. They know where their orders come from, at least. And one of our most venerable and distinguished statesmen, George Shultz, is also with us today, now with the Hoover Institution, but for many years an academic with MIT and also with the University of Chicago. The building we are in, Bechtel, was once, is still an organization, of course, but was headed up by George, who was also head of the Office of Management and Budget, and is one of the few people in public life who has held 4 cabinet posts. He was Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Transportation, Secretary of State, and is also known as the husband of Charlotte Maillard Shultz, who was recently honored by the opera just last night, and congratulations again to the Shultz family on that.
Let me interject. It would be news to Steve Bechtel that I ran the Bechtel Corporation.
He's here.
I worked there for Steve. He was the boss. And a terrific one.
We know who one of the chief capos was, George. That's all that. So my role here, of course, is to facilitate conversation, and we're going to talk for about an hour, and we're going to cover a pretty broad swath of territory, and then we'll bring you in with any questions you might have, and certainly welcome not only questions but comments that you might have. And I want to begin, and let's begin, Steven Chu, with you, with kind of a broad question, and I'll address this to all the participants. And again, thanks to the Public Policy Institute for sponsoring this, and actually thinking about what we'd initially like to think about, which is how California and the nation can benefit from the state's leadership. And the state's leadership on climate change and renewable energy, as you heard, has been considerable. And there's a great deal to be proud of here under different successive administrations. But California, even though it's made recent alliance with, as was mentioned, British Columbia and a couple of other states in the Northwest, cannot act on its own, and yet maybe in some ways it can and should continue to act on its own. Steven Chu, can we begin with you on this score?
Sure. Well, very briefly, just to remind all of you, I'm sure you all know, California has been a leader in many areas. From the oil shocks, the appliance efficiency standards were started. They became a model for the federal standards a decade or so later that just helps consumers save money by saving energy. Tremendous value there. If I look at the codes, the building codes, the local building codes and the state codes on building efficiency, again, remarkable. The attempt to try to decouple utility profits from the sale of energy, but to try to hold the bills, energy bills, constant is something we can all be proud of. So I just go down the list of all these things where California showed incredible leadership. And when I got to Washington, I started going to other members in the Senate and the House saying, you know, what people really care about is their energy bill, not the energy rate. And so if you simultaneously push efficiency and you allow the utility companies to recoup their investments, it's okay. And most of the states, so I would show a state which kept their rates very low, their energy bills, it was a remarkable correlation. The energy bills went up much faster than California energy bills. So these are things which...
Can I ask you how that was received from the congressional representatives you spoke to?
They said, wow, I didn't know this. And I said, yeah, well, here's the data, and you're welcome. Here's some links. And they said, no, this doesn't compute. Rates or bills. No, no, no. If you encourage the people in your state to save energy, the bills actually don't increase as fast or not at all. And it was like, this is a foreign language. But I just want to end by saying that California has continued to show leadership that later on, much later on, sometimes the federal government adopts. We should continue to do this. The little noises that you hear, well, we should always be in line with the total federal policy. If we had done that over the last 35 or 40 years, the federal policy would have been far behind. And so that's one of the things I think that we can be proud of. We should continue to do this. It's not only California, but other states have joined in. Majority of states have renewable portfolio standards. There's New York, Massachusetts, other states are going to try to decouple energy bills from rates. And so these are things that in the last analysis, the way our Constitution is written, our federal Constitution, the federal government adopts these things. So we in California become a template for the experiments that later proved to be quite effective in energy efficiency and decreasing carbon emissions, and we should continue.
Mary Nichols, I presume you also see California taking a lead and continuing to take a lead?
Yes. When it comes to climate policy, I would really date our leadership back to the late 60s and early 70s to the discovery of smog and action being taken by California on emissions, because I think as we now see it, the precursors of global warming, the greenhouse gases that we're addressing, by and large, are the same pollutants that we've been dealing with for years now, trying to fight smog in our urban parts of California. That is, these are the things that come from our power plants, the way we generate electricity, the way we move ourselves around. The energy system is what is the cause of our buildup of greenhouse gases. And our history in California, moving ahead of the federal government, as Steven Chu was suggesting, wasn't aimed at being independent per se. It was aimed at solving a problem that we couldn't get the federal government to act on. And so California had to step out and begin its own program. Since that time, every governor of California, including Governor Reagan, at some time or another, Governor Wilson had to go to Washington to fight for California's ability to continue to set standards that were more aggressive than the federal government at that time was willing to do. But there was a very powerful environmental motivation for doing it. I would argue that our action on climate change is part of that same pattern. I think Californians were ahead of others in recognizing the damage that global warming will do and is already doing to our state, not only to our economy, but to the natural resources that all Californians, whether you were born here or came here from somewhere else, recognize as being of great value. I will quote a comment that Governor Brown made at an international gathering not too long ago when we were hosting a group of technicians and bureaucrats who had come from India to talk about partnering with us on air and energy programs. And he talked about the fact that people around the world who don't know much of anything else about the United States know California. The name California has a certain evocative ring to it. And everybody in the world thinks that if they do some of the same things that we do, they will be like California, beautiful, rich, and diverse.
George Shultz, let me bring you into this. We were talking before we were having lunch together, and you were talking about the necessity to work with China And I think most would agree with that, particularly now that we see that China is putting out even more greenhouse gas than the United States. But I raised China because it's a great coal-producing nation, and here in the United States, California has been sort of, you forgive the word, sequestered in some ways by not having a big mining industry or producing a lot of coal. So how can we be a beacon to, or play a leadership role to places like, say, West Virginia or China for that matter, when on a completely different template?
Comments that have been made by my colleagues here. I was in Washington at a big event about 6 months ago, and I was preaching our California gospel, and somebody in the audience said, you Californians, you're a bunch of nutcakes. And I said, yeah, we care about the air we breathe. How nutty can you get? So I won that argument. But I do think that the key is what you do. It's important to identify the problems. It's important to say where we aspire to get. But in the end, you have to do something to get there. And one of the things that seems to me we ought to be doing, and I know we have been doing it to some degree, is to go to the Chinese, who really obviously know they need to work on this issue, and say, look, you're the biggest emitter in the world. We're the biggest per capita emitter in the world. So let's get together and figure out things to do, and then do them. Thanks in some considerable part to Steve Chu, the Energy Department has a thing called ARPA-E that promotes R&D in the energy field. And I think it's a fair statement, Steve, that now there is a larger and higher quality amount of scientific and engineering work being done on energy generally than any time before. So it's a key to keep that going, because it will produce things and is producing things. You can say, okay, let's do this and let's do that. And if we could make an arrangement with China like that and start doing things and let people see that they work, then there'll be emulation, just as I think in the comments about California earlier, when we do things in California that seem to work, then people emulate them. And that's how you get somewhere, by doing things. So I think that we have an important opportunity here to work with the Chinese on this, and I think it was referred to earlier. I think Governor Brown has initiated that on the California scale, and so we ought to take that idea and broaden it out to a broader audience.
How would California play a role in that, though? Or would California play a significant or central role in that as you see it?
I don't see how they could avoid it. We're there. And we have a big proportion of the ideas. And we have a big proportion of the R&D that's going on in our great university centers. It isn't only just Stanford and Berkeley, but down south. We have a huge amount of the work being done right here in California. So this is where you come to look.
And Steven Chu, what about alternative fuel, alternatives to fossil fuel and alternative energies? I mean, let's talk about the role that they might play, particularly as California spearheads or provides some kind of leadership.
Well, let me divide it into two sections. One is generating electricity, and the other is transportation fuel. And okay, I'm plugged in again. In the generation of electricity, the renewables, notably wind and solar, are becoming less and less expensive. The Wind Association, OEA, says that in 5 or 6 years' time, they may not need any sort of renewable portfolio standards. Don't give those up, but direct subsidies, production tax credits. The investment tax credit that's used is a main driver for solar. It formally expires in 2016, but my feeling is that such rapid progress has been made, is continuing to be made, that if you ran from 2016, 2020, 2022 down to the 10% investment tax credit that all investments get, solar will do just fine. And the reason I'm saying this is because there are proponents against renewables who are trying to convince the American public that renewables will always be more expensive than fossil sources. And
You keep hearing Solyndra, of course, right?
well, Solyndra is sadly, yes, that it was an unfortunate failure, but you have to put it in perspective. The largest solar company in China also went bankrupt, Suntec. There are many companies around the world that went bankrupt due to a temporary overinvestment in solar manufacturing capacity, and then followed by a worldwide recession. But so you have this little glitch, but I should also remind people that in any relatively new technology, there's going to be a shakeout of companies. If you consider the United States and automobiles, which is an established technology today, but in 1920 we had about 130 automobile companies in the United States. In the 20s and 30s we had a proliferation of airplane manufacturers. You'll expect a shakeout. That doesn't mean the technology is inherently bad. In fact, this technology is going to be here to stay. I still see so much technological headroom. And now it's the installation costs and everything else, those so-called softer costs, that are the dominant costs. The point I'm trying to make is that we're getting into a very, very exciting period of time where renewable energy can hold its own. I mean, we haven't solved, there's a distribution problem, there's a storage problem. That's part of renewable energy, and it's part of the cost of renewable energy. But we can solve those things in the coming 10 years, 15 years. We don't have to wait 30 years. And it's going to slowly creep up to get to 10 to 20 to 30, 40. Hydro's already 6. So the AB 32 is ambitious, but I think we're going to meet that, and the United States could meet it as a whole.
George Shultz.
As I said earlier, to give strong support for energy R&D. Probably Steve and I wouldn't agree on this, but I think it's a great mistake for the government to get involved in a commercial enterprise. That was the problem with Solyndra. They lost a ton of money, taxpayer money. And if a company's going to fail, let it be the private investors. And the structure now of the loan guarantee, I remember when that got started, it was started actually in the Bush years, and they came out and talked to me about it. I said, you're making a bad mistake. The venture capitalist is going to cut you to ribbons. They'll take the equity. You put up the big money in a loan. If it wins, they've been big. If it loses, you're the guys who lose. And it's much better off to keep the R&D, to take the D to the point where it's clearly doable and scalable, and let the marketplace operate. And I'm convinced it will, because as Steve says, these alternatives are getting more and more economic, and they stand on their own feet. I have solar panels on my house down on the Stanford campus, and I've long since paid for them by how much I've saved on my electricity bill. I'm driving an electric car, so I'm driving on sunshine. It's free. What's not to like?
Where does nuclear fit into this, in your judgment, George Shultz?
Well, it's a very difficult issue, I think, because you're playing around with something where the chances of something going wrong, like somebody getting a bomb and dropping it somewhere, or Fukushima, are very remote, but the consequences are gigantic. So I think that the rule for anything connected with nuclear should be safety, 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 safety. That has to be a total priority and not cut any corners. I think in our own case here, we've developed what is, I think in the world basis, a relatively unique form of regulation, where the people operating nuclear power plants know that if something goes wrong with any one of them, they all pay a heavy price. So the industry itself has a group of people, formally organized. They go around to each other's plants, and they know where the bodies are buried. And if something's wrong, they critique it. And we've had a really wonderful safety record with nuclear power as a result of that. And I think it's also a model for how to go about regulation. Maybe Steve would comment on this, but I keep reading about the small modular nuclear power plant, and that sounds like a very promising possibility. What about that, Steve? You wouldn't know that.
Well, so these are nuclear power plants. Instead of building 1 to 1.5 gigawatt massive power plants, which are $8 billion plus, they would be in smaller modules of a scale roughly 100 megawatts. Now, what the hope is that the economy in numbers, that they can be mass produced in a single factory and shipped places, would be one thing. So you, instead of economy of scale of a large power plant. Number two, the designs, at least the ones the Department of Energy wants to license, would be passively safe. That means you lose complete control of the reactor. You're cut off from electricity, you're cut off from water, you're cut off from everything, and they will not melt down. They will not release radiation. The question is it going to be economically feasible? We don't know. And so you're going to have to build a few to see if that economy of numbers takes off from the economy scale. But they inherently can be much safer than existing power plants, but even the newer designs are much safer than the existing ones. But let me also say that the current ones we have in operation, the NRC and the commercial producers, are constantly upping the ante in safety. So even though the reactor might have been built 20 years ago or 30 years ago, there's a constant upgrading of these reactors. And so I would agree with George, safety first. Another thing is non-proliferation, which he and I are very concerned about. This is not a concern for the United States, but a concern for other countries that might want nuclear reactors. There's this temptation to join a nuclear club, but there's also a temptation to, well, make a little bit of nuclear bomb material on the side.
James Hansen said to me that James Hansen, formerly of NASA,
Could I-
nuclear power, said he would have a reactor in his backyard, but this was before Fukushima.
Yeah, right.
I'd like to add a point to what Steve was saying. The small nuclear reactor, it seems to me, it has an additional advantage in that it is producing energy near where you use it. And I think our grid is so vulnerable to cyber attack and other interventions that from a security standpoint, we should be paying attention to the idea of generating more of the energy right where we use it so the vulnerability is less from a security standpoint.
You
Mary
know,
Nichols?
this is an interesting example of how easy it is to go down a rabbit hole about any kind of technology that looks like it might be the answer to all of our problems. Nuclear energy may well have a promising future. It may not. But it seems to me that from a bigger policy perspective, we're better off trying to set real targets based on what we need from the perspective of the planet, and then look for technologies and make them compete with each other based on a whole host of criteria. I think we tend to be fascinated by the nuclear topic because it's been off the table for such a long time. It's off the table in California because of a vote of the people. We cannot site a nuclear plant in California until there's a certification that we have a place to put the waste, and we're still a long way from that point. So everywhere I've been for the last years, some smart engineer in the audience will get up and say, if you were serious about global warming, you would be an advocate for nuclear power because it's truly GHG free. And I say, well, that is true, and at least with respect to the reactor itself, if you don't count anything related to the production of the fuel or the manufacturing of the reactor itself, you know, if you don't do a full life cycle analysis, absolutely it's GHG free. And I'm personally not opposed to further work, development, research, whatever people want to put money into,
Not opposed,
they
but
can
you
do.
sound a little iffy to me.
Well, my iffiness is let's not make this the solution, the holy grail that's going to be the answer. It just, you know, I've spent quite a number of years now as a regulator where there's always some perfect technology that's just beyond the horizon. If we would just wait for the hydrogen car, if we would just wait for the battery car, if we just had this piece of technology, that piece of technology. And what we've found over the years is that if you set tough standards that are based on what the environment needs to see, and then, as I think you would favor, challenge the private sector to meet those standards, they do.
We have no solution for nuclear waste, but we do know that if we had electric cars, or like George Shultz's cars that run on sunshine, or
Right?
electric cars, hydrogen cars, whatever, we could do a lot more
Well-
in terms of the carbon footprint. So
Correct.
let me ask you, especially having been head of the Air Resources Board for the last 6 years, whether you feel much optimism, because certainly I've done a number of programs, and what I hear from citizens who call in and send emails in and everything is they just feel the progress has been awfully slow, much too slow, lethargic, really.
I think that we've had amazing progress in the last few years on all kinds of zero-emission vehicles. California right now has a couple hundred thousand driving around, and we'll be seeing more with every year. I came from the LA Auto Show last week, and what I saw were not concept cars up there on pedestals, but cars that are being offered for sale in showrooms. They're not cheap. They are definitely still at a price which requires a subsidy, and there is a federal subsidy and a state subsidy for these vehicles, and they still are, I would say, a middle-class car, although if anybody is in a position where they can look at a car based on their operating cost and not just at their initial out-of-pocket cost, they will do very, very well with battery electric cars, and we're now seeing extremely attractive hydrogen cars that are going to be offered, fuel cell vehicles that are going to be offered for sale in California with fuel as part of the package.
What do you envisage
leasing.
as far as the scale of consumers with
Well-
these kinds of cars? Because we do have the technology.
Oh yeah, the technology exists. Getting it to scale, getting it to be truly successful in the marketplace is a work in progress. We've been joined now by 7 other states that have followed the California program and are now part of a program working together to develop some joint best practices around siting of fueling stations and looking at what kinds of incentives work and what don't. The car companies have done their part. They're making some great cars. Now what we have to do is to help provide the kind of infrastructure for those cars that matches, or comes close to matching even, what we've sunk over the years into the infrastructure for gasoline vehicles. And that's coming along pretty fast. We're going to be at over 1 million of these things by 2020. So California, this is one area where not only have we succeeded in doing something transformative as far as a technology is concerned, but we really are leading the rest of the
I'm
world.
heartened by how sanguine you are, and Secretary Shultz had something he wanted to add here. George?
I think the key is the battery. And the batteries have been getting a lot better. I drove an EV1 way back when. It was practically all battery, but it was fun to drive. It disappeared. Wasn't economic. Now the batteries are much better. But back on the R&D point, there's a guy down at Stanford in the materials sciences field who says, and most of the scientists around seem to think he's right, to have invented something that will improve the capability of a lithium-ion battery by a factor of 4. Well, if all of a sudden you can do something remotely like that to that battery, then your range anxiety problem begins to disappear. And you're not totally dependent on charging stations. You can go 250, 300 miles on a charge. That would change the electric car picture dramatically. So again, I come back to the importance of support for the energy R&D. And it's an important insurance policy. It isn't even that expensive in the great scheme of things. So I think it's a key.
Can you talk a little bit about, if you would, excuse me, Stephen, about Montreal and the insurance policy? I mean, that's a good example of where you would like to move forward, isn't it?
Well, back when I was in office, a lot of scientists thought that the ozone layer was depleting. I thought most of them did. But there were doubters. And so we discussed that. I had the privilege of twice a week private meetings with President Reagan. And so we discussed this issue. And we said, instead of bashing the people who are doubters and getting into a big fight with them, let's go to them and say, you agree that if this happens, it's a catastrophe, right? Right. Well, okay, let's take out an insurance policy. Let's all agree on that. So we all get in the boat and we take out an insurance policy. As it came along, the DuPont company came up with something that everybody could agree to do, as distinct from aspire to here. Put this into effect. And that worked. The insurance policy concept got us over the top. As it turned out, the scientists who were worried were right, and the Montreal Protocol came along in the nick of time. So I think to a certain extent we ought to say, look, to the people who doubt that the globe is warming, which is getting harder and harder, it seems to me, to stand up and make a case for, at least you would agree that if it happens, it's a big problem. So let's take out an insurance policy. What is it? The insurance policy isn't. Let's have strong support for energy R&D. Let's make the internal combustion engine flex fuel, so it isn't a kind of a monopoly for gasoline. Let's put into effect on a broad basis either a cap and trade system, as Mary is putting into effect here in California, or at least my personal preference is a revenue-neutral carbon tax that levels the playing field. It makes all forms of energy carry their true costs in the competition. And I make it revenue-neutral because I want to attract the tax mafia. Say, look, if it's revenue-neutral, not a tax, right? You can accept it. It's all just about leveling the playing field. Americans love a level playing field, so I'm selling.
Steven Chu.
Well, let me first say that their apparent disagreement is really not there, I don't think. I will go and support what's the role of government, both the California government and the federal government. It is in research and development. The closer you get to deployment, the more you should be backing off, the more you should be saying, let the financial viability of the technology serve itself. And so, and quite candidly, you know, by 3/4 of the end of this century, maybe half, maybe full, we won't need nuclear anymore. Renewables will, and transmission and storage will be with us probably by mid-century, in such that we can begin to say we don't need to extend beyond, you know, certainly into the next century. I don't think we'll need nuclear at all. We may not need it the last third of the century. For example, you spoke about hydrogen vehicles and fuel cells and things of that nature. I say we in the government should be investing in the research that develops that. I'm less enthusiastic about spending public dollars on fueling stations until we can get over, you know, where electric vehicles, there are major investments in companies. I'm less enthusiastic about spending hundreds of millions of dollars on electric fueling stations as well. The private sector can handle those things. But I say, you know, let's be agnostic on all technologies. You invest in R&D, and as the private sector begins to pick this up, you know, let the best clean technology win. And the beautiful thing is the clean technologies are going to be better than the more traditional technologies like fossil fuel in not a too long period of time. And so we don't have to have these forever subsidies. We don't have to do all these things. There's no disagreement, I think.
Makes me want to talk about fracking, but before I do that,
that's another technology.
let me just shoot to something else, though. First of all, I mean, we've been hearing about how necessary it is to roll back to the 1990s levels of greenhouse reduction by 2050. I mean, I'd like to ask each of you how realistic that is in your mind, and how realistic really a carbon tax is, too.
Well, we have to go much deeper than by 2050. I think we're going to have to get to maybe 20% of our carbon emissions of 1990. Not the rollback, I think, is 2020 or something like it. A very short period of time.
Yes.
That's very important. That's a completely achievable target, but it's also getting a plan in place so that you can, by 2050, be at 1/5 of the carbon emissions. If we don't do something on that scale, I am very worried about what's going to happen to the climate.
But you realistically think, I mean, because people like Bill McKibben, of course, are a lot more skeptical and a lot more concerned about actually reaching those numbers. Or if they
It
are
depends a lot on the technology and how it's going to improve and how the newer technologies become cost effective and replace the older technologies without, decades and decades of subsidies. I'm optimistic. I see more technology headroom in lowering costs in the renewables and in things like batteries than I do in other technologies.
Well, fracking is a part of that new technology, Mary Nichols, and
Let me
I'll make
answer
the
question
segue
first.
very quickly here
All right,
because
okay.
Governor Brown has said we need more scientific data, we need more scrutiny in terms of fracking, but the fact of the matter is we can do fracking, we know, and be less dependent on fossil fuels. As a result of the
Wait a minute,
technology.
wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Yes, and coal, right.
So to go ahead and do more fracking, in many people's minds, concern about groundwater and so forth is a peril, and yet at the same time, we seem to be moving in that direction.
Well, it could be both. You made a comment earlier, which I just want to correct about coal in California. While it's true that we burn next to no coal in the state of California, in Southern California, where I am from and live, about half of the electrical energy that we use is produced from coal-fired power plants. We burn the coal in other states. We import it into the state of California, but we are using coal to fire our electrical system. And it's part of our responsibility as we move forward on AB 32 to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions that we are also taking that on. That is, we're going to reduce emissions from the power that we are responsible for, not just the power that we generate inside our state. It is true that we are, at the moment, doing more to reduce that energy, that GHG emission coming from coal as a result of having cheap natural gas around in this country than anything else that's happened at the federal level, certainly through any kind of federal policy, because there's so much more natural gas that people are canceling orders or retiring coal plants earlier than they would have and replacing them with natural gas, which is a net benefit for greenhouse gases. The fallacy of that argument, of course, is that it's not nearly enough to get us where we need to go. And of course, it doesn't look at all the other environmental risks that are involved as well. It seems to me that you sort of have to ask yourself the question, and this was part of your earlier question to Steven Chu about, are we going to get to 2050? Well, I don't know. I woke up the other day and realized with a shock that I'm probably not going to be here in 2050 to find out how we did.
Google has had the Singularity Project, which is going to be extending life supposedly beyond anything we imagine.
Right, but
Ray Kurzweil will make us all live longer.
I do know that we're going to get to 2020. And I do know, based on my history and having benefited from the work of the gentleman on either side of me, actually, that we can make tremendous progress through technology. That is, human ingenuity and also good policy can move us in the direction of making very dramatic reductions in our lifetime in the negative impact that we're having on the environment. So I would like to think that we can make the kind of dramatic changes that it will take to avert the worst impacts of global warming. But then I have to be an optimist, because how else can you justify, getting up every day as a citizen of this planet and going to work unless you're doing your best to try to make a difference.
George Shultz?
Well, you were going to ask about fracking.
Yeah, I am.
It's a no-brainer. Of course we should go ahead with it. The big reductions that we have seen recently have all been due to fracking and the natural gas that has come out of it. So we certainly should do that. Are there problems? Yes. Are the problems known? Yes. Do people know how to deal with them? Yes. Have we an adequate regulatory environment to see that things are done properly? That's something that needs to be worked on carefully. And I think, as the example of the nuclear regulation that I mentioned, regulation that's over-the-shoulder type stuff really doesn't work too well. But regulation that gives people the incentive to do something right does. So I think that we should be exploring insurance policy concepts or other types of concepts to be sure that people who are going to do this have a stake in doing it right, as well as regulating.
George, could
But
you
it
say
can
something
work.
about the enforcement of regulations, though? I know that's a concern to you, isn't it?
Well, of course you want to enforce what regulations you have, but I think long experience shows that regulation, looking over your shoulder all the time, second guessing you, just doesn't work. Look at the financial industry. The New York Fed had inspectors inside Citicorp, tons of them. What did they do? When the head of Citicorp gets up and says, as long as the music is playing, you got to get up and dance. If you're a regulator, you might say, hey, wait a minute, I better look at this. Nothing is done. It's over-the-shoulder regulation. Okay to have that, but you've got to have the kind of regulation that I mentioned in the nuclear industry, where the people who are being regulated have a stake in seeing to it that it works well, and they look after it. And I think that kind of regulation can be designed.
Shortly, we're going to go and open things up to you, our audience, but what would each of you have to say just to individual citizens in terms of how they can, I mean, certainly with design and with doing things environmentally conscious about climate change, but just on a day-to-day individual level, what we call the quotidian, the everyday, what can people do? Mary, start with you.
We actually have a cool California website that you can get to from anywhere on California government's webpage that has a list of things that people can do and also highlights businesses that have won awards for doing climate-friendly things, and there are a lot of them. I'm sure most people are very familiar with some of the things you can do in terms of buying energy-efficient products and looking for green lights and Energy Star products that you can buy. In fact, Californians are well ahead of the rest of the country in terms of their preference for buying very fuel-efficient vehicles. The best-selling car in California is the Toyota Prius, as compared with the Ford F-150, which is the best-selling car in the rest of the United States. So, we Californians are putting our money where our mouths are already. Being conscientious voters, as was pointed out earlier, the people of California consistently have voted to maintain strong environmental regulations, even in times that were tough. And I think just being aware about what's going on and being an active participant in your own community when it comes to making choices about what kinds of buildings are going to be built and what kinds of people we're going to elect, those are all critical things for every one of us to do.
Secretary Shultz.
I'll give two examples. If you drive one of these electric cars or hybrid cars, the dashboard tells you how you're doing. They, in effect, teach you how to drive. And I see somebody roar by me up to a stop sign and jam on the brake and then accelerate. I say, that person doesn't know how to drive. They're taking twice as much energy as I use to get to the same place. So I think building into these devices the kind of feedback mechanism that tells you how you're doing is a very important instructive device. And I found it affects the way I drive, even a car that isn't that kind, because you just get in a different habit. So that's one thing. But then I remember also, Steve, back in whenever it was a decade ago, we had the big electricity crisis in California. And you remember our building was a 23-story building. We dimmed the lights, not so much that it bothered anybody. And since we had a lot of people who traveled, we said to her, look, if nobody's coming into an office, don't turn the lights on. So we did a few things like that. And as I remember, we saved 13% of the electricity we were using. And nobody was put out by it, just by being a little more careful and conscious of the problem. And I think having the subject on your mind and consciousness causes you to do a lot, almost without trying. So a lot can happen.
Secretary Chu.
I would go back to your original question because it seemed to me it was one of personal behavior questions. And so I'll go back to energy efficiency and conservation. It's been a kind of game I've been playing for the last 30 years. Then when we go into a new house and do this, how do you make it more energy efficient? How do you actually change some things? And the game is, my goal is, for example, we just moved into a new house in Menlo Park next to the Stanford campus. We saw the electricity bills of the previous owner. It was just two people, husband and wife, and then two people. Our electricity bill went to less than half because you just replace the key lights with compact fluorescents, or actually I dipped down really deep and bought some LEDs on certain lights where I wanted really instant on, and we're going to be on a lot. And just that simple thing dropped the electricity bill from roughly $100 a month to $40 a month to $30 a month. And then all of a sudden I was looking at this month's electricity bill, and it went from $30 to $40 or $45. I said, well, what's going on? And there was this, so the bill has day by day. And there was this one day on a Monday, my wife will never forgive me for this, but I was in Berkeley. She had a little dinner party over, and what she does is she wants to be a gracious host. She turns on all the lights in the house. And the electricity usage that day went up 2.5 times. So I said, Gene, you come to all my talks and you hear me tell you how boring it is.
But Steve, a girl's got to show a little independence once in a while. Come on.
Like I said, she will kill me for this. But I think, boiling water with the lid on, just minor things turn out to be huge things. And it's just personal habit, and you certainly don't want government to tell you to do those things. But it's something that you can do yourself, and you can train your friends to do, or tell your friends you're doing this. And your children are probably more, I hope, except the kids who keep their computer games on all night, also encouraging their parents, to not leave the water running, to turn off the lights when you're not using them, or other things. Or maybe the kids don't; they leave the lights on. But these simple things,
Good habits.
good habits.
Yeah.
But they make you feel better. But it's something we don't want to legislate, but it makes a huge difference.
Yeah. George?
We were discussing this with some military people who come down to Hoover, and an Air Force guy was there, and they're becoming much more conscious of energy use in the military. And he said, well, the way we used to do it is we say, we're going to take a plane from here to here. We figure out how much fuel it takes. We have a little extra and say, well, I'll fill it up. Now we say, wait a minute, we don't want to fill it up. That's weight. And the heavier the weight is, the more energy it takes to do it. So let's refrain from that extra weight. And hey, our planes are heavily painted. That's weight. Maybe we don't need quite as much paint. And these are just little things that happen when you become conscious of the problem and start reacting to it. And there are things you can do, and they don't cause anybody any trouble. They're just easy.
The military did something which is very difficult to do in civil society, which is that they began charging for electricity consumption and fuel consumption, so that the base commanders get a direct hit based on how much energy they use, and the forces also see the actual cost of the energy. So it's a security issue, obviously, in terms of where we're going to get the fuel from to fight in foreign places, but it's also a direct economic issue within the services themselves. And it makes a huge difference. Steve Chu's example, the way he's tracking his bills, and I assume he's paying close attention to how much he's paying for his energy, because he doesn't want to spend any extra money on it, because he's rather spend it on other things. Generally speaking, at the state level and in political life, we don't like to vote for things that cause voters to have to pay for what they're using for something like energy, because it's extremely unpopular. Again, the opening talk mentioned people's feelings about the cap and trade program. People think that businesses are getting away with something if they're allowed to trade for emissions, and that they want to see somebody else having to pay to clean up the pollution. They don't want to feel that they themselves are having to pay to clean it up. So it's a very fine line that we walk in trying to push for these exciting new technologies, as well as the smaller things that need to be done to make us all live somewhat more energy efficient lives, versus what we can actually get away with. And that's what we're learning as we deal with other societies that are just now trying to get up to speed with living the way we Americans
It's
do.
heartening to hear this. It disproves the old joke about military intelligence being an oxymoron. I want to go to one more
Listen, the
final.
military, I'm a Marine, so I follow the Marines and what they do. Now the Marines are worried they have to be quick and ready to go and so on, and the backpacks are getting heavier and heavier because they have all this electronic stuff and batteries in them. So what have the Marines done? They've invented a little device. You can hold it like this. They're using it in Afghanistan right now. And you can flip it open, no installation cost. It's 12 solar panels. So you charge up all your stuff, you lighten your load, and it's good, clean energy. Now this is, there's a company now that makes these, and people who like to go off on long hikes in the country and so on, they're becoming a commercial product. And it saves on batteries, and it's clean power, and it's energy produced where you use it.
I want to express gratitude for all the collective wisdom and light that all of you have offered, and move to our audience. But before I do, I have one other question that I'd like each of you to respond to, if you'd be so kind. And that is perhaps one of the toughest questions of all when we talk about climate change. And we saw this in the United Nations walkout. We're anticipating it again in Paris, and that is what to do about what many call the inequity of the overuse by the West from developing nations saying, you've had your day, now we want fairness, we want equity. Especially if we have the political will to move ahead, as all of you are suggesting optimistically. It's heartening to hear that optimism. But at the same time, we have the developing world who are getting hit very hard, as we saw with the typhoon in the Philippines, and as we see with a lot of natural disasters, certainly attributable to some degree to climate change. They're the ones, I'm thinking about the Maldives and places like that, that are going to be hit the hardest, and they're the ones who feel that they want equity, especially as they advance themselves. Why shouldn't they, in other words, have the same opportunity we had? George Shultz?
I think the way to address that issue, as we did in the Montreal Protocol, is to say, here are things that we're doing that can help the problem, and we hope you'll do them too, and by the way, we will subsidize your doing it. And we got up a fund to do that. So I think if you say, yes, we have an obligation to put up a little money, and we put it up, but we put it up in order for it to be used constructively, not just as sort of a penalty that disappears into thin air.
Mary Nichols, Steve Chu?
Well, I think that's right. I think foreign aid, foreign investment of all kinds need to be linked to helping the developing world develop in ways that don't replicate some of the mistakes that we made. We should be, without being dictatorial about it, we should be able to help other countries that want to achieve a higher standard of living do it in a way that's less wasteful, less emitting of greenhouse gases and pollution than the way that we developed. And I have not detected anywhere that I've been, or among any group of people that I've ever met with, a desire to create pollution. People just want to have more stuff. They want to live a better life. They'd like to be able to have a refrigerator, a television, turn lights on, get around from place to place. And that's a big challenge to do without emitting as much as we did in the process. But it is not, it's not impossible to do a whole lot better than we've done up until now. But, we don't have the ability to impose that on other people. It's got to be something that people will decide is something that's in their own best interest. And I think that's a case of developing some of these kinds of examples that we started talking about in the beginning, where, in partnership, city to city, state to state, or country to country, we work on some of these projects together, and then the good news gets disseminated that way. It's not a simple or necessarily a consistent process, but I think it's doable.
Some final thoughts from you, Steven Chu?
If you plot the wealth of a country in terms of GDP plus healthcare plus education per capita, it's called the Human Development Index, and you plot that against energy, you find that when you reach a certain wealth, it absolutely saturates. That is to say, you can use more or less energy above a certain wealth standard, and it's not using more energy doesn't actually increase the standard of living. And so if you look at many of the OECD countries, or we compare ourselves to a comparable standard of living, like Northern Europe, they're using half the energy we're using. Okay. So they want to, but they want to cut theirs by a half. So we certainly, without sacrificing our standard of living, in fact, allowing our standard of living to increase, there's no rule of physics that I know says you can't be there. In fact, and again, it saves money. That's just energy use in general, but then you decarbonize that energy, and then you maybe can get to our 2050 goal. You need that anyway to create the resource headroom for the developing countries. But it's also economic, I want to say this again and again, it's economically to our benefit to actually be a more efficient society. Yeah. And so the myth that energy consumption or consumption in general is directly proportional to the standard of living, just the facts don't bear it out. It doesn't increase the standard of living. We just do it in more wasteful ways. So we should be setting an example, we in the United States, we the most developed countries, to say we can have a very high standard of living. We're over here in terms of energy use, where this is higher energy use, so that countries like China, like India, and other developing economies can say, well, you don't have to go all the way over where we once were 30 and 50 years ago to backtrack. Build your infrastructure, build your buildings, build everything so that you land where we're heading also. So you don't follow what's called the Kuznets curve. It's named after an economist. It essentially says if you plot on one axis technology of the wealth of a society, the governance of the society, the open world,
Do what we do, not what we did.
Exactly, but that you go through this learning curve and then you go back and you over the lump of the Kuznets curve and you say, oops, we made a terrible mistake in air pollution, water pollution, this and that, and now we're over here. Is it possible to go to the end point without following the same mistakes of previous countries? Or, let's say, what we tell our kids, do what I tell you, not what I did. I don't know, but this is something where we as a society, a world society, need to get to, so we can get to this endpoint without all the, that previous 100 years or 100 or 200 years of history.
Let me open things up, and don't feel inhibited. If you have something you'd like to ask or say, just don't filibuster, and please feel free. Yes, gentleman with the glasses over there. I'll come to you with a microphone.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. It was a wonderful discussion. I'm Louis Bloomberg with the Nature Conservancy. And we heard a lot about energy efficiency and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that's very critical. We need to do more and do it more quickly. But we've also loaded the atmosphere with carbon dioxide. We'll have impacts at least for a century from what we've already done. And I wondered if the panel could share some thoughts on what kind of public policies or incentives or mechanisms that could be adopted by governments at all scales to address the impacts of climate change and reduce the risk and help communities respond.
Mary Nichols?
Well, one answer, I think, and I know where the question is coming from, so maybe it moves my thinking in that direction, but stopping the unnecessary release of carbon that's been stored in trees, in soil, in our communities would be a good place to start. And I know that's something that is being worked on around the globe, but creating incentives for people to actually reforest areas where they've cut down their forests to allow for faster and better uptake of carbon in natural systems that are a key part of what life depends on is also part of it. Making our communities more resilient to deal with the buildup of greenhouse gases that's already there in the atmosphere is something that we have to look at as part of that equation. Wetlands are part of the solution to living with the amount of global warming that's already baked into the atmosphere. So it's easy for us, because this is a sort of a technology-oriented panel, to focus only on that side of the equation. But it's absolutely fair to point out that there's more that needs to be done to both protect and enhance the ability of our natural systems to absorb greenhouse gases as well.
Take some more questions. I'm sorry, I'm looking in the back. One of the young ladies there in the back. Yes.
Yeah, my name is Elizabeth McCarthy. I'm with California Current. We're an energy publication. I have a question for Secretary Chu. You had said that renewables are always more expensive than fossil fuels. Is that true when you count in externalities and in a life cycle analysis? And also, if you couple the renewable energies with efficiencies, is that still true?
Well, actually, I think you misheard me. I said within a decade or two at the most, renewables will be less expensive than fossil fuel. That is wind and solar. New wind in reasonable sites is now the installed full levelized cost of wind nowadays is 6.5 cents a kilowatt hour. A new gas plant with gas at $4 a million BTU, it's about 5.5 cents a kilowatt hour. But we may not expect, if it goes to $6 a million, it will be comparable. But the technology for wind is improving, and it will drop in price. Solar is coming down dramatically in price. The modules went to 1/5 of the price of 5 years ago. So quite the opposite. Renewables will be less expensive, including transmission and storage by 20 years' time. I think that is part of the price. Now, that's excluding the externalities that we're talking about, the local air pollution, the global air pollution, all those other things. And so that is something else that absolutely needs to be taken into consideration. We ultimately will need some sort of price on carbon. Make no bones about it. Just as, it's always going to be cheaper to dump carbon into the atmosphere, just as it's always cheaper to dump a chemical effluent into a river if you happen to be upstream. It's very expensive for the downstream people, but in carbon dioxide, everyone's downstream. So we will need that price for other things to actually begin to capture some of the carbon, to actually make the final difference. Okay, because even when the technology is the same price, it's not good enough because of old habits. Okay, it takes more time. You've got to get more coordinated to think about how do you interplay the renewables with transmission, distribution, with energy storage. That's harder. It's a harder problem to think about. So that mental cost, and you see this in our own personal habits, you see this in the facilities managers of buildings. So you need a little government policy to nudge you. You need a lot of education. You need better technology. You need all those things. But let me, I said that some people are trying to tell others that renewables will always be more expensive. I violently disagree with that.
Take another question over here. Bring a microphone to you because we can't hear you. That's okay.
Hi, my name's Joey Hansel, and I'm from the League of Women Voters Bay Area Resource Committee. Nobody's mentioned carbon sequestration. Is that a reasonable technology?
I mentioned it at lunch, and George said, you shouldn't use that word, sequestration.
Well, let me start. Let me first say that what Mary Nichols said, reforestation is a form of carbon sequestration. Better agricultural practices, and no tillage, and actually doing some tweaks, and the whole symbiotic relationship between bacteria and plants and crops and forests to actually increase not only the carbon in the woody material, but mineralized carbon. These are forms of what agriculture is geoengineering. Let's call a spade a spade. These are very benign forms of reforestation is geoengineering, just as deforestation was geoengineering. So you do these things, and this is where I see less probability of unintended consequences to regrow a forest. And so these are things that are part of carbon sequestration. The thing I think you're thinking of is you get carbon from a point source power plant, a coal plant, a gas plant, a cement plant, a steel plant, and the coking processes. We need to capture the carbon there too in order to get to where we're going to sail through 500 parts per million, unfortunately, of carbon dioxide. We're at 420 or 410 now. We will need to sequester the point sources of carbon. We're going to need to capture and sequester. The technology for capturing that today is not cost effective, but this is an R&D thing, and we need to develop those methods. And then you have to figure out what to do with the carbon. We were talking at lunch about in enhanced oil recovery, depending on the formation, you can lose 20, 30, 50% of the carbon dioxide, meaning that it gets down there in the ground and doesn't come up. This is not a bad thing. The oil companies want to recover the carbon dioxide, but they're paying $30 a ton to reuse it to get more oil out of the ground. But there are technologies where I see carbon displacing methane in hydrates, not on the continental shelf, in the ground. So one molecule of carbon dioxide gets one molecule of methane up, you get a molecule of carbon dioxide back, you begin to break even. Those forms of sequestration, they might have what we need. But in the end, I think we may have to pump carbon into the ground in a way that would be safe, that doesn't stimulate seismic events, that doesn't do a lot of the other things. But we're going to have to capture some of the carbon. But let's start with vegetation.
We have time for one more question in the back. Yes.
Noel Perry from Next 10. My question, I guess, is for Mary, but very interested in what Secretary Shultz and Chu might say. I'm of the minority in terms of believing that cap and trade is a really good thing, and I'd love to see it get expanded. So I know that we're working with China, and we have our partnership with Quebec, and now we're doing some stuff with Washington and Oregon. So Mary, what do you envision over the next 5 years in terms of expanding these partnerships so that we can really have a tremendous regional difference here? Thank you.
Well, thanks for the question, Noel. I'm a fan of cap and trade now myself, but I have to say that it's been not as easy as people foretold when we first got into it. At least in the beginning, I think there were some, mainly I would say academic economists who would go around saying things like, well, you just design a cap and trade system, it's easy, and then that'll be so much more effective than direct regulation. And of course, we found that as with any system that involves creating a new currency, which is really what we're doing with allowances, politics immediately comes to the fore, and it's the same in any other system. It's the same with a tax, it's the same with regulation. People want to have more free allowances, they don't want to pay for allowances, they want to have more ability to decide how to use their allowances and so forth. So, it took us a few years to come up with a system, and the one that we ended up adopting in California has been a success in the sense that we've been able to demonstrate that it works, that you can get actual reductions, that you can operate the system without crashing the computers. You can, which is a big thing, by the way, in and of itself. You can run the auctions, and people could live with the system. And the fact that most people don't know about the fact that we have a cap and trade program, to me, personally is a triumph, because I don't think most people want to know the details of how this system works if it doesn't affect their lives directly, and we've designed the system in a way that most people's lives are not going to be affected directly, only those who should be getting a signal that they should be paying for using carbon, and they are getting the message. And overall, because we initially gave most of the allowances that people needed for free and phased it in gradually and so forth, even those who've been the most directly affected, I think, will say that the system is working pretty well and that they can live with it.
George Shultz, you had some final remarks?
So,
I think the cap and trade system is a very positive thing, puts a price on carbon, and it can work. The cap and trade system that dealt with acid rain has worked well, and Mary is working very hard to see that this one is done well. Cap and trade has the virtue that it doesn't sound like a tax, even though it's a tax. Personally, I'd rather have a garden variety tax and just call it a tax, carbon tax, and make it revenue neutral. There is an interesting experiment going on in British Columbia, and we have a sort of an alliance with British. They have a revenue neutral carbon tax there. At least some people get a little check that says, here's your carbon dividend. What's not to like? So there are alternatives, but I think somehow or other, as Steve has said earlier, we have to figure out a way to put a price on carbon.
Before I turn things back to Mark Baldessari, let me just, first of all, thank all of you. The fact that you're here is inspiring, and I hope you will carry forth in terms of your own commitment to ameliorating climate change and doing whatever you can on your own level and with your own organizations. I'd like to also extend warmest thanks to this distinguished panel for the enlightenment they provided for us this afternoon. Thank you to Steven Chu, Mary Nichols, and George Shultz.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. You did a terrific job moderating this discussion. I want to thank Sonia for her presentation, and Stephen and Mary and George. Really appreciated your insights and knowledge in these areas. Very important for the future of California and for our global future. And I'm reminded in your comments today about the important role that California leadership has had already in this dimension and is likely to have in the future. And I'm also reminded of the importance of not just talking about issues, but doing things. And I think the three of you are terrific examples of people who have who've taken action in terms of your careers to move things forward in the climate change and energy policy arena. And Michael, in your career as a journalist, really appreciate the public service that you've provided in raising awareness and continue to provide in your programs and as you have today. I want to thank everybody in the audience for being here, for participating with us in this outstanding program today, and encourage you to stay on and talk and find things to do in this arena. We've heard that there's plenty that we can do individually. Once again, I want to thank the Sutton family. I also want to thank the Hewlett family, but I see that Walter Hewlett has left. But the Hewlett family, of course, providing the initial gift, very significant gift that created PPIC nearly 20 years ago. We'll be celebrating our 20th anniversary next year. Please stay and join the conversation with us. And my board chair, Donna Lucas, has joined us. And so I have a chance to visit with her, as well as the Suttons and everybody on the panel. And thanks very much. Have a wonderful holiday season. Thank you for joining us today.